the neon-lit shadows of New York's elite circles, Soojin Han was a name whispered with absolute terror. He was the architect of the Korean Mafia's empire, a man who believed that every person had a price and every soul had a place. But the night he dragged a quiet black waitress named Kathleen into his private underground ring. He made a calculation that would cost him everything. He looked at her and saw a trembling servant in a stained apron. He had no idea he was staring at the Midnight Bolt, an elite underground boxer who had spent a decade breaking the world's most dangerous men in pits where there are no referees. As he stepped onto the canvas, Soojin Han thought he was about to toy with a frightened mouse. He was about to realize that the predator had just walked into the jaws of the prey. The air inside the Gilded Lotus turned to ice the moment the cognac splashed across Soojin's charcoal gray suit. The sound of the glass shattering against the marble floor was like a gunshot. Every lieutenant in the room stopped breathing. They knew Soojin's temper was as volatile as the luxury cars he collected, and they knew the penalty for disrespect was usually paid in blood. Standing in the center of the storm was Kathleen. To the men watching, she looked like a nobody, a waitress with her hair in a tight bun, her sleeves rolled up, and her head bowed in apparent shame. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked like the easiest target in the room. Soojin didn't yell. He simply stood up, the light catching the ink on his neck and the cold steel of his watch. He gave her an ultimatum that made his guards grin with cruel anticipation: 3 minutes in the basement ring. If she could stay on her feet, the debt of his ruined suit was settled. But as Kathleen walked toward the stairs, she wasn't shaking from fear. She was shaking because she was trying to remember how to hold back the bolt. Soojin Han thought he was teaching a waitress a lesson. He was about to find out he had just stepped into a cage with a monster. Kathleen adjusted the heavy silver tray, her fingers stiffly gripping the underside to mask the steady, rhythmic strength in her forearms. To the elite members of the Gilded Lotus, she was a background detail, a shadow in a white button-down that was slightly too large at the shoulders. She moved with a practiced, awkward shuffle, her head bowed just enough so that her thick-rimmed glasses obscured the sharp, scanning precision of her eyes. She had spent 3 weeks perfecting this dance of invisibility, ensuring that whenever she entered a room, the air didn't change. As she glided through the VIP lounge, the smell of expensive oud and burnt tobacco hung heavy. She leaned in to refill a glass of vintage scotch for a man whose hands were stained with more than just ink. "Careful, girl," he barked, not even looking at her. Kathleen let out a tiny, soft-spoken apology, her voice breathy and thin. It was a lie she told with every breath. In her mind, she wasn't seeing a customer, she was seeing a target. Her eyes flicked to the man's jugular, then to the way he leaned heavily on his left side, a weakness in his stance she could exploit in less than 2 seconds. She turned and navigated toward the corner booth, the Lion's Den, where Soojin Han sat. The air here was different, colder, pressurized. Soojin was a masterpiece of controlled violence, his luxury watch catching the dim light as he gestured with a hand covered in intricate dragon tattoos. Kathleen approached, her footsteps making no sound on the plush carpet. She saw the guards, Luca and Victor, positioned like bookends. Most people saw muscle, Kathleen saw mechanics. Luca carried his weight on his toes, a sign of a fast striker but one with poor balance if swept. Victor had a slight hitch in his right shoulder, an old injury that meant his defense was open on the high left. She placed a fresh bottle of cognac on the table, her movements intentionally clumsy. Her hand wobbled slightly, drawing a sharp, hissed, "Watch it," from Victor. Kathleen shrank back, her shoulders hunching to hide the broad, powerful frame of a woman who had once ended fights in a single round. She let them see the clumsy girl, because the Midnight Bolt was a ghost she couldn't afford to summon. She hated the way they looked through her, but she feared the way they would look at her if they knew the truth. She was a wolf wearing the skin of a lamb, and every day she spent in the Gilded Lotus was a battle to keep the wolf from biting back. As she retreated into the shadows of the service hallway, she felt the familiar itch in her knuckles. The silent, heavy weight of a power that was becoming harder and harder to suppress. The atmosphere inside the Gilded Lotus was a masterpiece of manufactured calm, but Kathleen could feel the tectonic plates of the underworld shifting beneath the surface. She moved toward the lion's den with a tray of crystal glasses and a vintage bottle of Cabernet, her steps measured and deliberate. To her right, Victor, Soojin Han's most volatile associate, was already 3 sheets to the wind, his loud, abrasive laughter cutting through the low hum of the lounge like a jagged blade. Kathleen saw the danger before it happened. She saw the way Victor's heavy, intoxicated leg kicked out in a grand, careless gesture as he leaned back to boast. She tried to pivot, her fighter's reflexes screaming at her to skip to the side, but her role as the clumsy waitress demanded a different reaction. She let her foot catch on Victor's polished shoe, a forced stumble that sent the tray tilting. The world seemed to slow down into a series of sharp, sensory snapshots. The high-pitched whistle of the bottle sliding across the silver surface. The frantic, useless grasp of her fingers. And then, the impact. The bottle didn't just fall, it detonated against the edge of the mahogany table. A fountain of deep, blood-red wine erupted, cascading in a heavy, rhythmic arc directly onto the pristine, charcoal-gray lapel of Soojin Han's custom-tailored suit. It soaked into the white silk of his shirt, spreading across his chest like a fresh gunshot wound. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The music seemed to die mid-note, and the clinking of silverware vanished, replaced by a cold, vibrating dread. Kathleen dropped to her knees, her hands trembling, partly from the act, partly from the sheer adrenaline of the confrontation she knew was coming. "I'm so sorry. Sir, please, let me," she stammered, her voice small and frantic as she reached out with a cloth. She looked up through her thick glasses and locked eyes with Soojin. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked down at the spreading crimson stain, his face a mask of terrifying, porcelain-smooth indifference. Every guard in the room had their hand on their holster or tucked into their waistband. The clumsy girl had just committed the ultimate sin in Soojin's world. She had made him look messy. She had touched the untouchable. As Soojin slowly reached up to unbutton the ruined jacket, the luxury watch on his wrist glinted like a predator's eye. The room remained ice-cold, the air thick with the realization that the invisible girl had finally become the center of a very dangerous world. Soojin Han did not scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply watched the expensive Cabernet soak into the fibers of his shirt, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. Slowly, he reached out and gripped Kathleen's chin, forcing her to look up. His fingers were cold, and the smell of his sandalwood cologne felt like a suffocating shroud. The surrounding guards shifted, their hands hovering near their waistbands, waiting for the signal to erase her from existence. "Do you have any idea what this costs?" Soojin asked, his voice a low, melodic purr that carried more threat than a shout. He didn't wait for her stammered apology. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes scanning her face, looking for the crack in her mask. 10,000 for the suit. 50,000 for the disrespect. In my world, a girl like you doesn't have enough years in her life to work off a debt like that. He stood up, towering over her, and began to pace a slow, predatory circle. "I have 2 paths for you, Kathleen. The first is the legal route. My associates in the precinct have a folder waiting for a name. By tomorrow morning, you'll be charged with grand larceny and assault. You'll disappear into a cell and never see the sun again." He stopped, his polished shoe inches from her trembling hand. "Or, you can provide my guests with a different kind of compensation." A cruel smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he gestured toward the heavy steel door at the back of the lounge, the entrance to the sub-basement. "I have a private ring downstairs. My men are bored, and they find the idea of a clumsy girl trying to survive a professional very amusing. 3 minutes. 1 round. If you're still breathing when the bell rings, your dead is buried with that bottle of wine. Kathleen kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart hammering a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the fear of the cage that made her chest tight, it was the intoxicating, terrifying lure of it. She looked at Soojin's arrogant, mocking face and felt the midnight bolt stirring in the dark corners of her soul, hungry and lethal. She let a single, fake tear track down her cheek, playing the part of the broken prey one last time. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. "I don't want to go to jail." Soojin chuckled, a dry, hollow sound, and snapped his fingers. Victor stepped forward, grabbing Kathleen's arm with a bruising grip to haul her toward the steel door. Soojin followed, adjusting his luxury watch, blissfully unaware that he wasn't leading a lamb to the slaughter. He was opening the cage for a monster he wasn't prepared to face. The descent into the sub-basement felt like a journey into a different circle of hell. The air lost the scent of expensive sandalwood and cognac, replaced by the heavy, metallic tang of old sweat and dried blood. As the heavy steel door groaned shut behind them, the dim, atmospheric lighting of the lounge was replaced by the harsh, flickering glare of industrial halogen bulbs. They stood in a cavernous space where the walls were raw concrete and the only furniture was a raised square platform draped in canvas that had seen too much violence to ever be clean again. Victor shoved Kathleen forward with a sneer, and she stumbled, her sensible work shoes skidding on the grit-covered floor. She looked up, squinting against the overhead lights that beat down like a physical weight. The contrast was jarring, her crisp, white waitress shirt, still damp with the red wine of her sin, stood out like a beacon of purity against the dark, grimy backdrop of the fighting pit. She looked absurdly out of place, a domestic bird trapped in a hawk's nest. Soojin Han followed her in, shedding his ruined suit jacket and tossing it to a waiting associate. He began to unbutton his cuffs, revealing the full extent of the dragons swirling up his forearms. He didn't look like a businessman anymore, he looked like a butcher preparing for work. Around the perimeter of the ring, a dozen men in suits gathered, their faces lit by the glow of their phones as they began to place bets on how long the clumsy girl would last. "Get in," Soojin commanded, his voice echoing off the concrete. Kathleen climbed through the ropes, her movements shaky and uncoordinated. As her feet hit the canvas, she felt the familiar texture beneath her soles. It was stiff, abrasive, and stained with the rusty ghosts of previous losers. To the men watching, she looked like she was trembling with fear as she clutched the edges of her apron. They didn't see the way her toes instinctively gripped the surface, testing the traction. They didn't notice that despite her shaking hands, her center of gravity had lowered, her weight distributing with a precision that only thousands of hours in the dark could produce. The hot lights bore down on her neck, making the white cotton of her shirt cling to her skin. Soojin stepped into the opposite corner, a predatory grin widening as he snapped a pair of thin leather MMA gloves over his knuckles. He thought the light was there to expose her weakness. He didn't realize it was merely illuminating the target. Kathleen lowered her head, the shadow of her bun falling across her eyes, and waited for the bell to ring, the sound that would officially end the life of the waitress and resurrect the midnight bolt. The sharp, electronic chime of the buzzer cut through the basement's humid air, sounding like a death knell. Soojin Han didn't hesitate. He moved with the practiced, predatory grace of a man who had been trained by the best instructors money could buy. He lunged forward, his first strike a stinging jab meant to humiliate rather than knock her out. Kathleen let it graze her cheek, her head snapping back with a force that looked devastating to the jeering crowd, but in reality, she had rolled with the punch, absorbing the energy before it could do real damage. "Is that all?" Soojin taunted, his voice slick with arrogance. He followed up with a heavy right hook. Kathleen stumbled back, her arms flailing in a desperate, uncoordinated mess that made the mafia lieutenants roar with laughter. To them, she was a frantic bird caught in a storm. To Kathleen, the world was a grid of mathematical certainties. She was calculating the 3-inch discrepancy in his reach and the split-second delay in his reset. Every time he hit her, a blow to the ribs, a clip to the shoulder, she was cataloging his rhythm. He fought like a man who had never been told no, leaning too heavily into his front leg and telegraphing his power shots with a subtle twitch of his jaw. She retreated toward the ropes, her white waitress shirt now smeared with the grime of the canvas. She let herself look winded, her chest heaving as she peered through her tangled hair. Soojin closed the distance, his eyes glowing with the cruel satisfaction of a cat cornering a mouse. He landed a stinging leg kick that sent her to one knee. Kathleen gasped, clutching her thigh, but beneath the facade, her mind was cold and clinical. She had him. She knew exactly how many inches he dropped his left hand when he went for a body shot. She knew the precise moment his weight shifted before he lunged. Soojin stepped in for what he intended to be a flashy, finishing blow, his luxury watch glinting under the hot industrial lights. He wanted a spectacle, he wanted her broken. Kathleen stayed low, her fingers brushing the blood-stained canvas, her gaze locked on the pulse jumping in his neck. The 3 minutes were halfway over. She had taken his best shots, and she was still standing. The clumsy waitress was fading, and the midnight bolt was beginning to feel the familiar, electric hum of the counterstrike. She just needed him to take one more step, one more arrogant, overconfident step into her range. Soojin Han circled her like a shark in shallow water, his chest barely heaving despite the exertion. He could see the sweat matting Kathleen's hair and the way she clung to the ropes, her white shirt stained with the gray grime of the canvas. To him, the fight was already over, all that remained was the formal execution of her dignity. He stopped just outside her guard, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his handsome features as he looked toward his lieutenants, who were already laughing and checking their watches. "You see this, Victor?" Soojin called out, his voice echoing with a jagged, condescending edge. "This is the problem with people like you, Kathleen. You think that because you work in a place like this, you can breathe the same air as us. You're a waitress. A server. A nobody from a neighborhood that doesn't even exist on my maps." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "I bet your father was just like you, a servant who knew how to bow, but never how to stand. Did he teach you that shuffle? Or did he just leave you with nothing but a name and a tray to carry?" Kathleen's head stayed low, but the trembling in her hands had stopped. It wasn't fear anymore, it was the cold, vibrating stillness of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. She felt the mention of her father like a spark hitting dry tinder. In the silence of her mind, the midnight bolt finally stood up. Soojin mistook her silence for total brokenness. He grew bored with the sport. He wanted to end this with a final, humiliating punctuation mark, not a punch, which would imply she was a worthy opponent, but a slap. He let his right hand drop completely to his side, his luxury watch flashing under the halogen lights. He didn't even bother to keep his chin tucked. He stepped into her innermost circle, his body completely open, and raised his left hand high to deliver a stinging, open-palmed strike across her face. "Know your place, girl," he sneered, his arm beginning its wide, lazy arc. In that split second, the air in the basement seemed to solidify. Soojin was so blinded by his own status, so intoxicated by the sight of her oversized apron and messy bun, that he didn't see the shift in her feet. He didn't see her weight move from her toes to her heels with a professional, lethal grace. The clumsy waitress was gone. The monster was finally out of the cage, and Soojin Han had just handed her the keys. The heavy, humid air of the basement seemed to freeze as Soojin's hand began its lazy, condescending arc. To the men watching, it was the final act of a one-sided humiliation. But to Kathleen, the world had slowed into a series of frames she had mastered 1,000 times over in the dark. The clumsy waitress vanished in a heartbeat. Her spine snapped straight, her chin tucked with surgical precision, and her weight shifted from a desperate stumble into a grounded, lethal pivot. As the slap whistled toward her, Kathleen didn't flinch. She executed a professional slip, a microscopic movement of her head that allowed Soojin's palm to fan the air where her face had been a millisecond before. The sheer momentum of his arrogance carried him forward, his chest open, his balance compromised by his own disdain. Then, the midnight bolt struck. It wasn't a frantic swing or a desperate flail. It was a short, explosive counterpunch delivered with the full rotational power of her hips and legs. Her fist, calloused and hardened by years of underground wars, traveled a mere 6 inches before connecting. The sound of the impact was sickening. A sharp, wet crack of bone and cartilage that echoed off the raw concrete walls like a gunshot. Soojin's head snapped back, his luxury watch reflecting a flash of halogen light as his arms flew wide. The untouchable boss was lifted off his heels, his body propelled backward by a force that defied his understanding of physics. He hit the blood-stained canvas with a heavy, ungraceful thud, his eyes rolling back as the room fell into a terrifying, airless silence. Kathleen stood over him, her breathing shallow and controlled. She didn't adjust her glasses, she didn't fix her messy bun. Her fists were held in a tight, high guard, her feet moving in a rhythmic, predatory shuffle that sent a chill through every man standing at the ropes. The oversized white shirt, once a symbol of her servitude, now looked like a shroud. The lieutenants froze, their jeers dying in their throats as they looked at the woman they had called a mouse. For the first time in his life, Soojin Han was looking up from the dirt, and for the first time in years, Kathleen D. Bradburn wasn't afraid of the monster inside her. She was finally home. The silence following Soojin's collapse lasted only as long as it took for the shock to turn into rage. Victor was the first to move, his face contorting into a mask of disbelief as he vaulted over the ropes, followed closely by Luca and 2 other lieutenants. They didn't see a woman. They saw an embarrassment that needed to be erased. But as they rushed her, Kathleen didn't retreat. She stepped into the center of the ring, her movements fluid and economical, her white waitress shirt snapping like a flag in a storm. Victor swung a wild, heavy haymaker, fueled by cognac and wounded pride. Kathleen didn't just dodge it, she parried his forearm with a lightning-fast slap and used his own momentum to pull him into a short, devastating knee to the solar plexus. As he doubled over, gasping for the air she had just stolen, she pivoted on her heel to meet Luca. The massive man tried to grapple, reaching out with hands meant for crushing, but Kathleen was a phantom. She dipped beneath his reach, her feet dancing a rhythmic, professional pattern on the canvas, and delivered a 3-punch combination, liver, solar plexus, chin, that sounded like a drumroll. Luca's eyes went vacant before he hit the floor. The basement was no longer a club's secret dungeon. It was Kathleen's office. She moved with the predatory grace she had spent years trying to hide, turning the narrow confines of the ring into a masterclass of spatial awareness. Every movement had a purpose. When the third man tried to tackle her, she used a clinical sidestep and a stiff jab to the bridge of his nose, stopping his momentum dead. She wasn't just fighting, she was dismantling them. She was the midnight bolt again, a force of nature that operated on timing, leverage, and a cold, focused clarity. The men in the shadows, the ones who had been laughing and placing bets minutes ago, were now backed against the concrete walls. They watched in a terrifying, breathless awe as the clumsy girl moved through their best fighters like they were statues. She wasn't breathing hard. Her oversized apron fluttered with every pivot, a mocking reminder of the disguise she had finally shed. By the time the 4th lieutenant hit the canvas, the only sound in the room was the hum of the halogen lights and the soft, rhythmic scuff of Kathleen's shoes. She stood in the center of the carnage, her guard still high, her eyes scanning the room for the next threat. The arena belonged to her now. The prey had finished the hunt. The basement was thick with a new, suffocating kind of silence, the sound of an empire's foundation cracking. Soojin Han lay sprawled on the blood-stained canvas, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen through a shattered ego and a broken nose. He was conscious, his eyes glazed with a mixture of agony and a sudden, terrifying realization. He looked up at Kathleen, not as a master looking at a servant, but as a man who had finally glimpsed the abyss. The luxury watch on his wrist was cracked, its ticking heart silenced by the very violence he had cultivated. Kathleen stood over him, her shadow stretching long across the ring. She wasn't breathing hard, her pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum that matched the fading adrenaline in her veins. She reached for the strings of her apron, the dark fabric that had served as her shroud for months. With a slow, deliberate motion, she untied the knot and let the heavy cotton slide off her shoulders. She draped it over Soojin's face, covering the crimson stain on his ruined suit with the uniform of the woman he had tried to destroy. It was a shroud for the man he used to be. "My name," she said, her voice no longer breathy or weak, but resonant with the weight of iron, "is Kathleen D. Bradburn. Remember it the next time you think you found someone who can't fight back." She turned away from the wreckage of his lieutenants, her footsteps steady and purposeful as she walked toward the steel door. The men in the shadows parted like a dark tide, none of them daring to breathe, let alone reach for a weapon. They didn't see a waitress walking out, they saw a ghost reclaiming her life. As she ascended the stairs and emerged into the cool, crisp night air of Manhattan, Kathleen didn't look back at the gilded lotus. The oversized white shirt caught the glow of the streetlights, no longer a disguise, but a trophy. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, letting the tight bun fall loose, her natural curls catching the wind. The midnight bolt wasn't a monster she had to hide anymore, it was the fire that had forged her. She wasn't running, and she wasn't hiding. She stepped into the darkness of the city, finally at peace, a queen who had burned down her own cage and walked through the ashes with her head held high.